Hello, and welcome to the SQV conversation, where we always honor the small, quiet voice inside by speaking with inspired individuals who are activating empathy in their own community. The SQV has gone hyperlocal and national. It has even gone global with our diverse list of dynamic guests. But when you meet today's guest, I'm sure you'll see that our little podcast has now gone first class as we welcome the United States preeminent suicide prevention consultant, Dr. Sally Spencer Thomas, who asks, is one suicide in your organization one too many? Dr. Sally, welcome to the SQV.
Ooh, what an introduction. Kapow. And everybody just lower your expectations like 3 notches. We're just going to be human beings here.
Well, I've been impressed with you since the moment I met you. Actually, since Jen Daniels told me about you, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to meet this woman because the work you're doing is going to change the world, my friend. So hats off to you.
Well, hats off to you too. And I'm very, very grateful to be invited here. And as you know, like when we met, it was like twins coming together. Like we just have a similar passion for the things that we're doing, a lot of alignment. And I'm just so grateful to be here with your listeners today.
Thank you. We have to honor the small, quiet voice and have these conversations. That's what it's all about. Stories change the world. So in a nutshell, you're such a dynamic and such a busy lady. Tell our viewers a little bit more about you.
So let's see. I'm a mom. I have 3 adult sons, 26, 23, and 20. So in the period of life of empty nesting, and it's been a grieving challenge. I think I'm starting to see the tail end of it, but boy, was that tough. I know, I was just like, rip the Band-Aid off. Wow, who am I if I'm not your mama every day? But then I realized I'm still their mama. It's going to be okay.
Yeah, I sent my middle son off, who was the last one home. I sent him off on Wednesday. So I'm going to be calling you, tearing my beer. Help me out. What do I do?
Oh my gosh. And but, at the same time, like this is what you built them for in this moment, is to go fly and create their own lives. So it's a very interesting time of life. And then I'm also a daughter. And I think I shared with you before we started that, my dad's facing the end of his life. So these years are about a lot of change and life transition all at the same time. And then I was thinking in the same breath, like, how lucky am I to have 3 adult sons that are living their lives and parents that are still alive. So I'm dealing with a lot of that personally right now. And I'm it's just a lot to process, and a lot of gratitude and a lot of grief. I'm also a psychologist by training, although I haven't done therapy for a long time, over 20 years, because I loved learning about it. I loved studying it. Didn't love doing therapy. And that was a bummer to get $70,000 in graduate school debt and go like, oh gosh, this isn't for me. And at first I felt like this huge sense of failure, but then I was like, no, not everything's got to be for everybody. And I can apply this knowledge to something different. And so it took me a couple decades, but I figured out I'm an impact entrepreneur. So today I try to create gap-filling things to prevent suicide and to help people find a passion for living.
Wow. So this work doesn't just fall upon you. You don't just wake up one day and say, I want to give my life to this cause. So tell us briefly what happened to your brother.
Yeah. And since, so my brother, 2.5 years younger than me, my best friend growing up, my only sibling, tremendously gifted in so many ways. He was a 3 varsity athlete. He was the kind of guy like lit up a room, just charismatic and funny. We called him the Pied Piper because people would follow him anywhere. And by his mid-20s, he had launched a company that had done really well. So he had all the trappings of success, the homes, the cars, the clothes, the stuff, all the professional accolades. But what people didn't know was that he fought fiercely against depression. He actually had bipolar condition, but he thrived in the lower ends of the mania, which is called hypomania, which a lot of entrepreneurs have actually, where it's just a lot of energy and creativity and influence and drive. He loved it there, but then he would have these episodes of depression and he'd be really, really in a bad spot. And so that went on, and he managed it out of the world's view for a couple decades. And then he had a full-blown episode of mania in the summer of 2004, and he wrecked his life in a very short period of time. And he never really recovered. And at this point, I've probably been in the field of mental health about 16 years. So I knew what was happening, and I knew he was in trouble. And we did talk about suicide, and we did connect him to resources. Like, I did all of the things I was supposed to do, and he did all the things he was supposed to do. But I honestly thought by the time he came back to us, he was estranged from us for a period of time. By the time he came back to us, he was really coming back to say goodbye. So we had him just for a short period of time. And then he died by suicide on December 7th, 2004. And like many of your listeners who've had these pretty big tragedies in your life, like my life is never going to be the same. And he had that impact, like a tsunami effect, through his friends and our family. And it's just been a long recovery process, really complicated recovery process. But literally on the night that he died, his really good friend Sean turned to his wife Heather and said, "Oh my God, what do we do?" And she said, "Don't let him be forgotten." So Sean's wheels started turning, and by January of 2005, he had convened all of us, the ones who loved him the most. And in our grief, we resolved to do what we could do to fill gaps, not recreate the good work other people had done, but like figure out some gap filling work. And that's set us on a journey that continues to this day.
Wow. So you and Sean are still partners in your work, or are you guys?
Oh no, that was the other thing. Like right away, it was my little family, which it was just my brother and me, and my parents were only children, so just them and my brother's wife, and then my brother's closest friends from across his lifespan, which were all like 34-year-old white men who were recently becoming fathers and emerging in their careers. So they got us started, but then pretty soon rolled away, as startup boards often do. And still support us. Like I'm still in touch with a lot of my brother's friends periodically, but that was their job, to do that in his legacy, to start it up. And then they didn't really want to run a nonprofit anymore. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, it is. I can only imagine the challenges that come with that. And then you have the raw grief of him. So I'm sure that, that process and building that company and building your legacy in his honor has really put you on a different trajectory. So talk a little bit about that. How has your path changed, and the work you're doing, how is it impacting communities now? Because that's what the SQV is all about. We want to know how you're activating empathy in your community. And I know your community is worldwide. So yay, good for you, Sally.
No, it's been fascinating to do the global part of it. I'll get to that in a second. But when Carson died, I was actually directing a leadership development program. So I'd gotten out of counseling a long time ago, and somebody said, "Hey, we got some money and an idea. Do you want to create a thing?" I'm like, "Yes, please." So we made a leadership development program at Regis, and I loved it. It was a good use of my psychology degree. And then Carson died. So for about 4 or 5 years, I was doing leadership development and suicide prevention at the same time. And it really gave me a perspective of what change looks like. What change looks like at a systems level and a cultural level is much different than what it looks like on an individual level. And I learned like, oh, that's how you move levers, and oh, that's how you change culture. And it was fascinating. So we did a lot of started projects in that space that, again, are still going on today. One of them was man therapy. Mantherapy.org is a way we're creating empathy in our communities, because there's a whole bunch of men, really tough, self-reliant, stoic men, reaching their hand for help with mental health is just not something that is easy or comes naturally. They're usually the one that everybody leans on, and they're the one that they solve all the problems for everybody. But when it comes to their own mental health, sometimes it's not great, and they don't let other people know. And then they're really at risk for really bad depression, suicide, and overdose and addiction and all these things. So we created this men's mental health program that's really great, mantherapy.org. We actually use humor as the way to bring men into the conversation and give them the tools to be self-empowered to take care of this health part of their health like they do others. And it's more than just a creative idea. We actually had it tested in highfalutin science, a randomized controlled trial that took 5 years, funded by the CDC. And we can say that, yeah, it works. It's great. So there was that. And there was, some things around storytelling that started to emerge that I still feel really passionate about today, helping people who've had these really dark times, whether it's suicide, loss, or an attempt, or suicidal thoughts, or even caregiving support roles, helping them turn some of that pain into purpose by figuring out how to use their story to shift things. And that's been so rewarding. Just seeing people own their narrative, be proud of the fight, be proud of the honoring that they're doing, and come out the other side with a clean idea of what they want to change in community and how their story helps get us there. Love it.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing to watch.
Telling stories is so important. And I write about that in my book, because I feel like when I was writing my book, I was telling a story for other people's benefit. And so that's what you've been doing. You've been cultivating these spaces where people can share it, and it is a vulnerability, and it is something that is safe, and it is something that people can connect with. And I think that, that's where our two worlds collide, because we want to develop at SGM Consulting Services, we want to develop humanizing systems for the workplace. So
Right.
that brings me to kind of why you and I first started our conversation. So let's talk about suicide prevention in the workplace and why it's so important to meet people there.
Yes. Well, that brings me back to also the international stuff. So when we started looking for gap filling things, we're like, well, what's going on in these other countries where they actually are having suicide rates go down? Because we're certainly not figuring that out here in the United States. Our rates continue to go up. And one of the things I started to appreciate right away was that other countries have a different narrative about suicide. In our country, it's all about broken people and broken people that need pills and therapy. And I'm not knocking that, because I've done both myself and they've helped me. But that is our only narrative. That is it. That's all we have. If you are stressed or distressed, you need to be fixed, you broken person. And that's just not how the rest of the world sees it. The rest of the world sees we have a lot of broken environments where anyone would be suffering, anyone. And we need to fix up those environments if we have a fighting chance of getting in front of suicide. And so looking at countries like Canada and Australia and the UK, they've done a lot more work in understanding this thing about work-related suicide or psychosocial hazards at work, and how the workplace can be a contributor to suicide or a contributor to healing. It can be a convener of toxic relationships, or it can be a convener of really healthy community. And it can be a conduit into permissive cultures that increase problems, like a very permissive alcohol culture. It can be a conduit into healthy things like training on how to have compassionate conversations and other ways of building teams that foster deep sense of meaning and growth together. So the workplace has such power when you think about it, of all of the hours that we're there and the relationships that we build and the way that we connect into a community bigger than ourselves. And yet the workplace is often woefully underprepared for things like suicide, addiction, and overdose. They're so scared. So our job is to really say, hey, you do this in other spaces, you can do it here. You've trained your people in CPR. This is not that different. You've created, healthy living initiatives and well-being initiatives that, foster fitness. It's not that different here. We just need to move your thought about health and safety just over a notch. And if we do it right, you're going to save lives and certainly make people have better lives. And so it's been a little bit of a long slog in the beginning to convince people. But today, especially after the pandemic, people are like, okay, we get it, that we have a role to play for our workers and their families to help create healthier communities. And that's been just a really fun road to go on.
I've done the research about this, and I know you have too. It's like half of all companies are considered bad places to work. You and I are not competition, my friend.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much work to be done, and there's so many different people that want different types of consulting. And it's, if you're doing something, that's better than nothing. Now, what you offer in the workplace suicide prevention website, I told you this months ago, I spent an entire Saturday diving into that website and trying to get certified and doing all the things for my own company. And it is a robust website, and you have done a great job with that. But talk a little bit about, so if you were going to a mine that was transitioning from, coal to solar, something like that, they had all these issues, they had all these problems, and they're worried about supporting their people. So you would come in and you would help them go down this path of this system that you've created to prevent suicide. Can you talk a little bit about what that would look like and what different aspects are fitting into that training for that specific group?
Yeah. So, and also shout back at you. I mean, when I first met you and I were like, you are addressing some root cause things here that are so important to people, like time off, time with your family. Like, how do we systematize it so that workplaces are actually doing that and doing it well and giving people the boundaries that they need to take care of themselves and their families? And, all of these other systems changes. I'm like, yes, we're speaking my language. This is great, because so few people understand that. So ideally, we would start partnering with an organization before they're hitting a huge transition like that, because once you've got that kind of transition going, people are already like on fire, and self-protective and like sabotage and conspiracy theory. And that's a really hard place to come out of. So ideally, we would be in front of that. And one of the things that we really believe and also know from a lot of public health data is that the better we're at the prevention stuff, like the upstream culture change kinds of things, the less problems we have downstream with the crises and the mental health emergencies and the overdoses and the, suicides, because culture change is the biggest lever that we have. And so it's things like getting finding someone at the top level of an organization, someone who's got respect from the whole group because of the position that they held and the way that they lead. I need someone up there to say this matters. And not only say this matters, but say it matters to me, your leader, because here's how I've been personally impacted by it. And they don't have to share like their most horrible trauma secret from childhood to get that kind of connection with the people in their workforce. They can literally just say that it matters to me because my life's been touched by this and I understand how important this is. That's all they have to say for people to say, oh, you too, right? Or things like reassurance. Like if you're struggling, you come to me because I know how hard it is to find the right help. Okay, I got your back, and we're going to persevere until we connect you into something that's helpful. Or my favorite example is when leaders say, clear my schedule at 3:00 on Thursday because I'm going to therapy. I'll see you on Friday. That's it. That's all they need to say. They don't need to disclose why they're going or anything like that. They're just modeling. I'm taking care of myself, or I'm taking care of my family. This is how I do it. Therapy's great. I'll see you on Friday.
It all starts at the top. It all starts at the top. That's so beautiful. And I love all the things you just said. I could piggyback on all of them, but I'm going to stick to my script here. You're
okay.
Okay, so this is a really interesting question, and it's one that I think that everyone asks after something happens. And in your field of work over the last 20 years, what have you learned about why people die by suicide?
So it's often a perfect storm of many, many, many variables, but there are some common denominators. And I'm going to cite the work of Dr. Thomas Joyner here, who, has spent decades researching how all these known risk factors, right? We have over 200 known risk factors. All these known risk factors and these warning signs kind of come together in common areas. And he's basically boiled it down to 3 things, which is great because 3 things we can fit in a podcast. One of them is this idea of feeling like a burden. When people feel like a burden and maybe think that their death is worth more to the people who love them than their life is, that's a cause for concern. And there's a lot of ways that people can get to that feeling, even though the rest of the world might not see them that way. That's what they believe. So if they've had a major failure experience, if they have had a financial crisis, right? They've lost their job, or their house is in foreclosure, or the fall seems so great with a demotion. Or maybe they've got a health issue or a mental health issue, and they don't want people to worry about them, or they're afraid they've messed stuff up so much that people have to take care of them. Or maybe they've done something they view as humiliating or shameful, something along those lines where they feel like they've caused pain or harm to other people, and that really everybody will be so relieved when they don't have to be that burden anymore. So it's kind of the flip of conventional wisdom about, oh, that person's so selfish. Really, in the mind of a suicidal person, it's often the ultimate selflessness, because they really do believe people would be better if they were gone. And then the second part of that equation is around feeling profoundly alone, profoundly isolated. And it's not that they're necessarily like living alone in a remote place, although that does contribute. It's more that they just feel so disconnected and detached, or they had really good relationships and they lost them, or they really felt like they belonged to a community and now they don't. That sense of feeling really, really profoundly lonely is a big one. So you put those things together, and suicide often comes on the menu for people. And I always say, like, suicide's not in and of itself. Suicidal thoughts are not in and of themselves bad. They're just thoughts. And I have come to understand them just like other intense emotions and intense experiences, like fear and anger. These are warning signals. These are bells that your body is giving you. Something needs to change. Like, right, with fear, you're in danger. With anger, there's conflict here in a really important relationship. You need to address it. And with suicidal thoughts, it's a big lever. It's like an existential lever that you need to know that you matter, and you need to know that you belong, that you are loved and lovable. I mean, these are big questions, right? So all of those things come together and drive that desire to find escape or relief from pain, and suicide becomes the door through which people find that. So the third variable that leads people into suicide is this idea called capability, which means they can do it. So we have ideas about doing it, and a lot of people have ideas about doing it. About 15 million people in the United States every year stare it down, and about 50,000 people die. So the capability part usually means the difference between thinking and doing, and who's most lethal. So capability means I can stare death down. I've been fearless my whole life. So a lot of people who are inherently, like from birth, risk-taking, fearless, maybe reckless, they're much more at risk for suicide death. People who have had a lot of trauma in their past. So life and death is kind of like a common thing for them. Childhood trauma, military trauma, sexual trauma, all kinds of trauma. And then the other part of capabilities, you just know what to do. You have access to, knowledge of, and familiarity with lethal means. So you know what to do and you can do it. So firearms, high places, medicines, all kinds of things. If you're familiar and you know what to do, you would use that. And so that's the perfect storm to come together. So it's partly about the despair and distress. It's partly about access to lethal means. It's partly about temperament. And it's about whether or not people are showing up for you, letting you know you matter and letting you know you're loved. That's not the whole thing. It's more like how you experience that. But that's a big thing when people feel like they've lost that.
Yeah, the communication part is really valuable, and support. You know, everybody needs support. I feel like for me, if you are a good friend, you will be a good friend. And if there's like this synergy that happens with your friendships, but a lot of men, they don't pour themselves into these friendships, so they feel more alone. And I think that, you know, the statistics say that, you know, men are 10 times more likely to kill themselves than a woman because of that. I think that's why.
Yeah, it's about 4 times for the men. Men are 4 times more likely to die. Women are about 3 more times more likely to attempt.
Yeah.
So it's not a difference in despair, although women tend to be more proactive with their health overall. That's why we live about a decade longer. And we have often stronger support relationships throughout our entire life. So those things help buffer us, but we also tend to use less lethal means like pills and cutting. So we are more likely to live through it and get a fighting chance to get a second chance, where men do not have that, even though, you know, people who've lived through like a firearm attempt often get a new release on life because they realize they changed their mind. People change their mind all the time. And thank goodness, right? Thank goodness people change their mind.
Yeah, I've known so many men that have killed themselves, and I don't think I know one female. And it just, I mean, I have a friend that tried, right? And she's lived through it, and she's a testimony now. She's probably somebody you should talk to. She's an amazing woman. I'm going to tell you about her later. Okay, so let's talk about this. If you're feeling despair right now, and this makes you feel a little personal, what can you do? Where can you call? How can you get help?
Sure. So there's a lot of people out there right now feeling trapped, feeling overwhelmed by emotions, feeling overwhelmed by life circumstance. And if that is you, please let someone know, because a lot of times people can't recognize it in other people. They're too busy, or they don't want to believe it's true. And it's not that they don't love you or see you. It's just that they're not picking this up. And so the best you can is let the people that you trust are going to hold you with dignity in their hearts and have their, I call it the benevolence of you, in their intention. Like they're going to take really good care of you. So think about who your A team is. Maybe it's friends from a while ago. Maybe it's a mentor or an auntie or a coach or someone who really knew you, who got you. Let them know, all right? Because it's really your A team that's going to be with you for the long haul. Recommendation number 2 is that if you're really, really struggling right now, 988 is our suicide prevention lifeline, suicide and crisis lifeline. And you don't have to be on the brink of suicide to call it. In fact, they would prefer that you are not like on the edge of something when you call it, but that you're just struggling, because they can help you create some plans and action steps and support you in finding some resources. They're 24/7 free. There's special lines for veterans and Spanish speakers and LGBTQ plus and all kinds of things. But 988 is really a one and done kind of experience. It's not going to be like ongoing relationship building, skill building types of therapy or counseling. So I would also recommend that if you are a young person or somebody still in school, often there's free counseling sessions through your school that you can access. If you are somebody working, very often your workplace will have an employee assistance program that'll give you some sessions that are covered under your benefits. And PS, if they say you have 3 sessions, it's usually 3 sessions per issue per year. How many of us have just one issue? We have lots of issues. So
we have a lot of issues.
Yeah, we've got a lot of issues. So you just go back.
You get it.
That's right. If you're begging for some more counseling sessions, guess what? They are going to give them to you.
Awesome.
So those are just some options for people, but also just acknowledge that navigating our mental health system is hard. And when you're already feeling depleted and trapped, like bring a buddy with you if you can. Bring somebody who's going to help advocate for you, help you through all the paperwork and the foraging in the forest for the right mental health resource, because it's really hard work, and especially when you're feeling, kind of at your lowest. So get a buddy to help you find the right resource. And then you don't have to take the first one. That's my other thing. Yeah. It's kind of like dating. It's not always going to feel exactly right with the first thing that you get. So again, it's okay for you to stand up and say, that doesn't feel like a good fit. What else is on the buffet? Mm-hmm. Because it's really your life and you have the power to choose what you feel is right for you. All I know for sure is that, like most health issues, most people don't get through it with white knuckling. It's going to tend to get worse if we're not addressing it. So see if you can find something that feels like a good fit. And I'm up for whatever works for people. Animal assisted therapy, all kinds of alternative therapies. Peer support, I think, is brilliant and beautiful. Look at the buffet, pick what feels right to you. Spiritual kinds of things, absolutely.
Exercise. Get outside.
Exercise.
Yoga. Yeah. There's so many things you can do to contribute to mental health. It's music. I mean, all of the things.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, because you touched on this in the last question, but I wanted to make sure that we provided people with some type of triage if they are feeling hopeless. 988 is a great resource.
Yep.
In your work, which occupations are at the most risk right now?
So when CDC came out with their first report in 2016, it became very clear that male-dominated industries are at highest risk for death. And again, I'm not saying women are not suffering. I believe we all suffer equally, but death data is a little easier to track than suicidal thoughts and behavior because people track death data. So very clearly, it became not only the male-dominated industries, but male-dominated industries that have high risk-taking and a lot of other contributing factors like using their bodies. When you use your body for your work, chances are good eventually you're going to get injured or you're going to have some kind of chronic use issue with your back. And once you've gotten into pain, when you've got 5 minutes with your primary care doctor, what do they give you? A script for some kind of opiate-based pain medication. And now we know one pill that your physician gave you to help alleviate your misery increases your risk for an opiate addiction exponentially. And that's a horrible thing, when you go in to get healed so that you can go back and provide for your family and you end up with this life-threatening addiction. It's awful. So there's that. There's a lot of permissive culture of drug and alcohol use, a lot of travel away from family. So all these similarly bound industries have that alongside very stoic, self-reliant, problem-solving, decisive people. That's why they're good at what they do, because they have those qualities. There's the superpowers, but this is the underbelly of their superpower. They're not likely to be proactive in getting support for mental health. The good news is, as I'm finding in at least a lot of the construction partners that we work with, like the first responder communities, the military communities, there's already a really good mindset and core value around helping one another and helping community. So that's easy to tap into. And once they get that and they're like, oh, I can actually be a change agent here for good and save my brothers and sisters, they get so excited about what their role is. And so that's just taken off. And that's been really rewarding.
Good. Yeah, I bet so. I would love to get in that work. My husband is in construction and it's been tough. And I get what you're saying, but he's one of those managers that really shows up for his people and really cares about them and gets them support they need. But you're right. There's not a lot of guys that will come to the table and say, hey, I need help in this way. So that's why there's lots of different ways that you can ask for help. We've all had these things happen in our lives. And so from an employer's basis, if something like that happens, what is important for them to do in the days and weeks following a suicide in their midst?
Yeah. So historically, when there has been a suicide, and not necessarily the suicide of an employee, it could be an employee's family member, it could be a client or partner of the work, or it could be a vendor, or it could be a retiree or an intern. Like there's so many different ways that a suicide death impacts a work group or an organization. Or recently released employee. That's often a big one because again, that fall seems so great. So there's lots to do. But what usually happens is people are not prepared and they get back on their heels and deer in the headlights, and then they don't do anything. And they're like back to work. And everybody who was impacted is like, we can't work because this just happened. So about, I don't know, 12 so years ago, we created this manager's guide to postvention. So postvention is a term that we say when we're in the aftermath. And our granddaddy of postvention, his name is Dr. Frank Campbell, and he says postvention is prevention for all those left behind. Because complicated and traumatizing experience around suicide grief usually has a long tail, especially if you're like in the inner circle. This is not the kind of thing you're going to bounce back from 3 days later and be ready to dive in and make widgets or whatever it is that you do. It's right here for a long time. For me, like I had just had my third baby in September, Jackson. So I had used up all my maternity and FMLA leave. And then he died. And so then my community threw in all their leave to get me through the holidays.
Awesome. It's so good when companies can do that.
I know. I was like, I didn't really even know it was happening. You know, they just did it. And then I had to go back to work. Eventually I had to go back to work, but I told my boss, and I said, I am so not functional right now. And I loved my job. I was teaching, I was organizing these conferences. I was like, I got nothing for you. I mean, I could literally put my body in the office and that's about it. And she said, that's okay. I mean, I was just greeted with such grace in that period of time, and everybody just chipped in, you know. And I do think like we do that when people have a natural disaster and their house gets taken away by a tornado, or people have babies with special needs, or when people have cancer, but we don't always do it when there's a mental health related thing because people don't know. They don't know what to do. So we created this postvention guide that really helps walk managers who, by the way, are also in the middle of the grief and trauma response, just like everybody else. So they're also not fully able to do the things that they are usually able to do, a compromised leader in a space of a lot of people that need support. So we were realizing that we made it super simple. Like, here's a checklist. Here's 10 things to think about before you step in stuff that's going to be harder to undo later. So it's immediately, how do you notify people? How do you offer practical assistance? What if there's a cleanup situation? Like, how do you deal with that? Like all kinds of really practical steps. And then short run, how do you help people that are still very activated by this? It's usually not everybody at that point. It's a shorter group. And then long term, you know, upwards of a year or more, how it was now a much smaller group. How do you honor the service and the friendship through anniversary and milestone celebrations of the life that was lived for the people that were most deeply impacted. So there's, again, flowcharts and templates for communication and all kinds of things that a manager who's trying to lead that response can have.
Mm-hmm. And where could someone that was interested in your work find that information if something like that occurred at their organization?
So if you're interested in workplace related things in general, workplacesuicideprevention.com is the place to go. When you click under resources, you'll find the postvention guide and a whole bunch of other things. But if you just Google, if you can't remember that, if you just Google manager postvention, it's posted in a million places. This is just a free PDF. But if you get to the workplacesuicideprevention.com website, you'll find a whole bunch of additional, a whole Saturday's worth of stuff.
Yeah.
To dive down into. I know.
It's so good. It's so good. Yeah. I thought maybe I wanted to do a suicide certification, and I said, not my cup of tea. And I need to find somebody that's qualified. So yeah, you get all my referrals, and I just can't wait. I just can't wait to start partnering with you and getting these companies integrated into this goodness that you're giving to communities. So I had one more question about suicide, because I think it's important in communities where a suicide has taken place. There's oftentimes subsequent suicides. Can you talk a little bit about what some might call the copycat effect, but more adequately the exposure effect that is entailed with this? And in a school or in an organization where this happens, how can we prevent that from happening again?
Yeah. So historically, we've been most concerned about what traditionally we've called copycat or contagion, where if one young person dies by suicide, we're bracing, because there is some evidence that if the communication is handled a certain way, it may increase risk that somebody who's already vulnerable, so it's not like you put the idea in someone's head, they're already vulnerable, but they over-identify with how that death was handled. And so the romanticizing and the glamorizing of that death has been shown to maybe have a connection. Talking too much about the means or the hot spot, if there's a specific spot that was glamorized or shrined, that kind of thing. So the postvention communication, especially around communities that are vulnerable to this effect, and I like to call it exposure effect. There's a bunch of us that call it that, because it's really not the person who died that's contagious, which makes people even leery to talk about their best friend or what this person brought to their community, which is just a shame, right? So all of a sudden their whole life becomes invisible. So not talking about this person, this human being that we lost from this in this really sad way, but it's more of the glamorizing and romanticizing, talking too much about the means. And now I truly believe it's not just the youth where we have this problem. I also believe we have this problem with our military. I mean, oh my gosh, the amount of veterans I speak with, especially veterans that came through the tours most recently, they can count on, full two hands, people that were intimate friends with them that they've lost by suicide, and they're in their 30s, it's unbelievable. So I do think that's happening there. I also worry a little bit about our LGBTQ plus 25 and younger community. So here's the anecdote to that, which is, we have to balance the stories of grief and loss with the stories of hope and recovery. And we have, again, really good science. It's not like a good idea. It's good science called the Papageno effect, where we can demonstrate that when we have stories that illustrate coming through suicidal despair, growing through it, healing through it, and we share those stories, we create hope in other people. We create a sense of community that I wasn't the only one that went through this. There's other people here who understand what I went through. And on a community level, we don't get so, oh my gosh, stuck in the tragedy of this, but we actually see like the humanity of it. And once we get to that humanity place and the thereby the grace of God go I place, which is another piece of it, because we tend to other people and they're like, oh, we're not like those people. Yeah, no, just you wait. You have no idea what your life is going to throw at you. Be grateful and humble in this space, because chances are good it's going to show up for you in some way or another. And you're not going to want to be othered, or you're not going to want your loved one to be othered. So be humble and realize this is a human condition issue.
Yeah, for sure. Dr. Sally, this is all such good information. It's going to help so many people. So thank you for sharing this with us today. Was there any final thoughts you'd like to say, and perhaps you'd like to answer one more question for me, which is a fun one.
Let's do the fun one.
Okay. If you were an animal, what would you be and why?
Oh, man. That should be an easy question. If I were an animal, what would I be and why? Oh, I don't have a clever response for that. I am a massive dog lover, and I have 2 Australian Shepherds. And for me, these are the perfect creatures. And one of them's having a very interesting dream right now, right next to me, barking, twitching. Rocky, are you okay? Rocky, what are you chasing over there? Because they're so loyal and loving and beautiful and smart and super fast. I'd like to be a little faster, but they're just good herding dogs. So they're good at bringing the people together. In terms of final thoughts, I really do want people to know that really the most important thing to do around helping people through the other side of suicide is showing up for them on their darkest day. My mentor said the person most likely to save your life from suicide is someone you already know. It's someone who stands by you in that dark time and doesn't have to fix anything or do anything magical. They just need to have that presence and that compassionate curiosity and that kind of authentic alignment with you to let you know that you matter and you're not alone. And that has been so helpful for so many people. And it's so simple and fundamentally human, but we forget it because we get scared. And so that's the part I want people to remember.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Well, you're helping a ton of people, and I appreciate knowing you, and I appreciate our partnership that's blossoming.
Yes.
And, let's just keep the dialogue going, because this is the work that's going to change the world. Us Gen Xers, we're ready to change the world. This is what we're going to do. So just get ready, y'all. Have a great weekend, Sally. Namaste.
Namaste. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.